Greetings and welcome to the channel. Welcome to the Northworthy Sagas and Story. Now today's video is a folk tale, and one of these very rare folk tales and stories about Jesus, or in the Viking tongue we would call him the Svarte, or the White Christ, as he was often associated with wearing white robes and clothing of wool and linen. Now what you're going to get from this story, you're going to be entertained and you're going to learn something. You're going to learn a very old story about the stranger that came to the door. Now there's various different titles for this old folk tale, but I'm just going to tell it in the way I was told it. And this is only two folk tales I know of Jesus walking on earth, or to us Vikings, Middle Earth, having adventures. Reminds me of the stories of Thor and Odin walking on Middle Earth and having adventures and doing things. So many years ago, in those medieval times, the times when our ancestors, had tougher times, when you struggled to get food on the table, when food was very important, farming was very important. If you're lucky enough to own land to grow food and to raise cattle and sheep and animals, wild stock to eat, and boars and pigs, chickens, etc., you was very well off. But for the average person, who may live in a small village, they would not have land. They'll just have a small garden, perhaps, enough to grow some herbs, some plants that will make the food taste better. And our tale goes back to those times. Whether it is a medieval tale, well, that's to be debated. Perhaps it's a bit of a later tale, but I often think that these tales all go back a long way in time and are told from generation to generation. And because of that factor, we lose that heritage of when they was first created and when they was first told. But in my mind, I like to think it's a very old tale. So one day Jesus, the Son of God, the most holiest of all men, the Saviour to the Christians, I don't mind Jesus. I think he's a lovely, interesting, fascinating character because he brings positivity and he brings love, and both of those things are very important. Well, he was walking about. He was having a bit of fun, watching the birds, watching a few cattle in the fields, picking up some flowers from the hedgerows, walking along old roadways. But like anybody else, he was getting hungry. I mean, yes, fair enough, he could have just magically made a loaf of bread appear in his hand, but he didn't want to do that. He didn't want to form his own miracle to feed himself, because I guess he kind of thought that was wrong. Yes, if he got 40,000 people to feed, then he could magically make bread appear and feed everybody. But this wasn't the case. He was on his own. But in the distance, in a small valley, he saw a village with a few longhouses. And he thought, well, I'll go and walk in the village and I'll knock on the first door I come to and I'll see if they can't feed me, give me some food. But at the time of this tale was told, people were going through starvation because the season before, the year before, wasn't too good and crops struggled to grow. And so people were starving. People were worried about, where we're going to get our next meal from. And so Jesus, the White Christ, Svarte, walked into his village, and the first longhouse he came to, he thought, I'm going to knock on this door. And so this is what he did. He went up to the doorway. It's an old longhouse, wooden construction with a thatched roof, single story, so not got to the stage in history where people were building up and building 2 or 3 story houses yet. A long hall where people slept, ate, and sometimes kept their wild and animals for feeding in the wintertime. Of course, there was none of that in this longhouse. So the White Christ went up, he knocked on the door because he was always very polite. And, he said, hello. He said, I'm a lonely stranger walking through your village and I'm hungry and I want some food, please. Could you help me out? Well, of course, a lady appeared and looked at him up and down. She did not realise it was Jesus. She just thought it was some random stranger who was having a walkabout and probably heading somewhere in the distance. She said, Oh, I'll struggle to do that, my duck, my dear. But in the distance, in the longhouse, in the middle was a hearth, a fireplace. It had wooden walls of good wood and earth in the box, and on top was the fire. And hanging from the rafters, the beams of the longhouse, was an old cauldron, a kettle from an old iron chain. And Jesus saw this and thought, well, you're cooking some food. And he said, well, what you got cooking in your pot, in your kettle, in your cauldron? And the old woman didn't say anything for a few seconds. She looked him up and down again, thinking, who's this stranger asking me what I'm cooking? And she was a widow because her husband died in a battle. And she had 3 children to feed. And I'm sure you agree, if you're going through times of starvation and you've got to feed your children, then that can be very stressful. And certainly within the modern age we live, people are going through that still today, which is pretty bad really and shocking. Even myself at times struggle. And so Jesus looked at this kettle, this pot. I thought, well, you must be cooking and boiling something. And he said, well, what are you cooking in your pot? What are you cooking? And the woman looked around to make sure her children wasn't listening. They was asleep in a big bed with a hay straw mattress and a couple of blankets and some fur on top, because it was getting towards the time it was autumn and it was getting cold. Well, the woman said, well, I'm boiling stones. And Jesus looked at her, took her back, and said, what do you mean you're boiling stones? I said, well, I've got no food. There's nothing in the house. I've been to my neighbours and they're in the same situation. But they've got no food either. So we're just surviving on what crumbs and what little bit of food and bread we have. But I thought to myself, this woman said, if I put some stones in the pot, at least it will trick my children into thinking that I'm cooking something. Well, I'm sure you agree. If you're in that situation and you're pretending to boil food and actually boiling round pebbles and stones, then that's not a great situation. But suddenly the woman turned round and she looked at the pot, and for the first time in a long time, it was full of peas. Little green peas. And she thought, she was astonished, where this appeared from? The stones have disappeared. And peas have been put there in their place. Of course, we know what's happened, don't we, in this story? It is Jesus, being kind and caring, he performed a miracle and changed the stones into peas so that this old lady and her 3 children could have some food. And she was very generous. She invited this stranger into the house, gave Jesus some fresh water, and gave her some peas. And amazingly, she also found some bread. And the children, the old lady, had full stomachs for the first time in days. And I hope you found this bit of a story entertaining, and don't forget to subscribe for more, because we do love our folk tales and I'm learning quite a few at the moment. But it's also reminded me of the other story about when Jesus turned a woman into an owl. And what this means from the point of view of Christianity, I find quite fascinating. Well, again, one day, the spite of Christ, Jesus was out having another walk, looking at nature and all the things he'd made and produced. And the gods have produced, well, God himself, not the gods. In my mind, as a Norse pagan, that would be the case, but not in the case of the Christians. And so, he looked at the hedges and he looked at birds and little robins. One landed on his finger and he said hello, had a little chat. And he looked at the wild cattle in the fields and the flowers and the butterflies. And you've been doing this all morning. But again, he was getting hungry. I mean, even Jesus Christ had to eat. He may be the Son of God, but he is also human as well. And we all need to eat food and drink tea. Cheers. And so, Jesus again, in the distance, saw a longhouse in a village. And he thought, well, I'm going to go to this longhouse because there's bound to be a baker baking bread. And in this tale, the seasons were great. The crops had managed to grow and people had a lot of food. And so he came to a longhouse with an open front area, and inside this open front area was a clay bread oven, actually two of them. And so he knocked on the door a few times, and an old woman appeared, and he said, "Hello, I'm a stranger walking through your village, and I'm a pilgrim, I'm starving," because this was during the times of the Christians in the medieval age. And he said, "Could you bake me a small loaf of bread? And I'll be very grateful." Well, the old woman looked up and down at this stranger again in his whitish robes and linen and wool, and thought, yes, I'll help you out because I'm a kind and caring Christian. And so she went to a kind of a wooden bucket or chest, and she pulled out the most massive piece of dough, and she formed it into a loaf shape and put it in the oven. But just as the woman was putting this dough into the oven, her daughter came out and started reprimanding her mother. "What are you doing?" she said. "You're putting too much dough in that oven." And they had a big argument, and the old lady disappeared back into the longhouse. And her daughter, or Dacia in Anglo-Saxon is where the word comes from, I learned something, took the dough out and took a small piece of dough, made it into another loaf, and put the other dough back in the wooden box, and put the small bit of dough back into the oven, the bread oven made of clay, with a clay floor and some hot, bits of wood at the back that had been burning. Well, Jesus wasn't very happy about this, so very suddenly he flicked his fingers, and the woman, the daughter, turned into an owl and was sat there, in this open bit of the longhouse. And then her mother came out and looked around and said, "Well, where's my daughter?" And Jesus didn't say anything. She saw the owl and thought, "Well, that's a bit weird, isn't it? An owl, often a sign of evil or death to some cultures. What do you think of that? What do you think seeing an owl means?" I'd love to read your comments, and please leave me an owl emoji. Oh yes, I always wonder what the sign of seeing an owl actually means. And so, she looked around and couldn't find her daughter. Jesus said nothing. She took the bit of bread out and gave it to Jesus, and off he popped on his way, on his journey, walking around Middle Earth to us Vikings, or Earth to the Christians. And that is also the tale of the baker's daughter was an owl. But I also find it funny that within this whole, collection of folk tales and stories from these times that have been collected by people like Catherine Briggs, who we really must thank back in the day for collecting these folk tales, but also the people before her, like Norton, who collected the Norton tales. We really must be thankful that they collected these tales and wrote them down. But it's funny, within this whole world of storytelling, within this whole world of folk tales, I only know 2 stories of Jesus. But yet I could name you dozens of stories about the devil. You got the devil and the tinker, how the hedgehog raced the devil to death. You got the devil's ditch. You got the origin story of St. Christopher when he met the devil. It goes on and goes on. And quite ironically, within these tales, if I said that right, the devil never wins, which I'm so thankful about, because I'm not a fan of the devil. I mean, in my mind, the devil is a modern interpretation by the Christians of Loki. Let me know what you think about that in the comments. So, yes, fascinating subject. I do urge you to go and read a few folk tales or buy a book. There's some wonderful books out there, and perhaps in the future we'll review a few books. And if you found this video to be entertaining, if you like the channel, then please subscribe, and please stick around for the next video, because we do love producing content on this channel. And being English, I love my cups of teas in bow china cups. And on that point, I will bid you goodbye. And please, folks, don't forget in life to practice goodness and kindness, because together we can make the world a better place and bring peace and harmony on this planet, which I think will be a wonderful, wonderful thing. So it's goodbye from me, goodbye from Braggy, and I'll see you. Yes, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.